Welcome to Career Tools. This week, books to read, or if you've already read them, read again. Here we go. Folks, if you don't know it, on our website, we have a book review section. It's under the Community tab on the homepage, and all the books that either community members or myself or Mike or anybody else on our team has read are there, and with comments. Actually, I take that back. Not all the books. Some of the books are so terrible we don't review them. If you've read some of the books we're going to talk about, please go and make a comment. Help other people choose to read these books. Thanks. Okay, so when you sent me this cast, I kind of raised my eyebrows. I said, well, we've talked about all these books a bunch.
We have, and my answer was we've talked about them all a bunch, and we've always talked about them in a different context. Like, you know, Bossidy says this, or Peter Drucker says this in relation to another context, and we've never talked about the books themselves. Right,
and we've never ever said on air probably, these are the books you need to read no matter what, and this is actually a short list. So good, and books are important. Reading is a fundamentally important part of self-development. It's the cheapest, fastest, most flexible. And now with Audible.com and Kindles and so on. Dan McGuire told me the other day that he was reading a book on his Kindle and then got in his car, in his Kindle on the ferry or something, and then got in his car for the last leg of his journey home one evening. And because Audible and Kindle are both owned by Amazon, it immediately switched, and Audible knew where he was supposed to start.
Wow.
Yeah. So I could be convinced.
That said, I maybe have 30 books in hard copy now, and these, actually 4 out of 5 of them are 4 out of 5 of the ones I have in hard copy. Yeah. Because I just want to highlight them and put tags in them and stuff, and I can't do that with Kindle as easily.
Good. So the books we're going to talk about, they are?
Effective Executive by Drucker, of course. Execution by Larry Bossidy. People Smart by Tony Alessandra, Getting Things Done by David Allen, and Management by Drucker, because Drucker's so good, he gets to be on the list twice. And then at the end, we're just going to talk about why reading books rather than blogs or other forms of written material are a good thing.
Yeah, blogs, even my blog, compared to a book, yeah, no. And frankly, any Drucker book ranks all the non-Drucker books, in my opinion. There's the old joke about President Kennedy when he was feting the Nobels and when he was president in the White House, and he said, this is the finest, I'm going to get the quote wrong, but this is the greatest gathering of minds, intelligence in the White House since Thomas Jefferson dined here alone. And I think we could say that about Drucker as well. And you just recently forwarded me a quote that I had heard 40 years ago, which is Churchill saying Drucker is so good. It's sublime. So, okay, let's talk about the effective executive.
No one, hopefully, who's listening to the cast didn't expect us to include it. And for me, it has something new every time I read it. Every time I read it, it's like, oh, I didn't get that last time. And I think that's something about books that you don't get from other media. Like there's an idea in a book that the teacher appears when the student is ready. And when you reread the book, the different ideas come to you because you're in a different place.
Exactly. You're ready for something different. Exactly.
Yeah.
My general rule for picking a book is if I flip through it, which one no longer does, or at least I don't. When I used to flip through them in the bookstore, the question was, do I get 3 good ideas or 3 interesting thoughts from it? And I would say Effective Executive has hundreds. And I'm with you. When I reread it, I go, I read that part and I thought I got it, but now I really get it. And that's the beauty of really sublime writing. The Effective Executive is the most important business book that I believe has ever been written. It is dense, right? You can't really read it in an afternoon, but folks, it's only 120 pages, maybe. It's quite slim. It's just really condensed. And it is probably the most highlighted book. It's not just the most highlighted book per word that I have. It's the most highlighted book. And, you know, you compare that to some of Tom Friedman's books, which are 500 or 600 pages. And that's saying something, that 100 page book is more valuable than that.
I just looked. I have the copy on my desk while we're recording this, and I looked. It's 174 pages. But just as I opened it to the conclusion, and the conclusion is effectiveness must be learned.
Yes,
which is 4 words and yet contains a universe.
Yeah, I think also there are a lot of people who don't read it because it's about executive life. No, I'm sorry, that's wrong. 30 years ago, that was true, and it was less popular than it is today, even though it was popular back then. More people have come to realize how brilliant Drucker was, and people didn't read it back then because they thought it was for senior leaders. Now, so many people want to be executives without really understanding why or what they're getting into. They then think they should read this, and a lot of it will be over your head, and that's okay. But if there was only one book, business book, that I could read, it would be this one. And in fact, that's why my book is The Effective Manager, as an homage to Peter Drucker and how important the effective executive is. And because workload trickles down in organizations, it's the nature of things. 40 years ago, folks, you had to be an executive to have the authority to schedule a meeting. Authority, responsibility, tasks always trickle downward in organizations. It is how organizations get better, frankly, is to do things for cheaper every year. And the things that Drucker talked about 40, 50 years ago when he wrote it are valid today for individual contributors and managers, let alone executives.
Yeah, nothing's changed about a business, and business is run to make a profit.
Yeah.
And, you know, even if the examples are different, the world hasn't changed that much.
Yeah. Chapter 2 is the single most important chapter of any business book that might ever be written. That's probably that's talking down about the future, so I shouldn't say those kinds of things. But it is that good. Chapter 2 about one's time. I have more clocks in every room than some people have in their house, simply because time is the great resource that is gone and can never be reproduced. I mean, they're actually making more land on coastlines, and certainly money always increases, but man, time just goes away and it's gone forever.
Chapter 5 is First Things First, which
yeah.
is famously Stephen Covey, but I think Drucker got there first.
Yeah, Drucker got there quite a bit sooner. I've heard Covey talk about Drucker, and at one point he just shakes his head and says, "How is this not required reading?"
So the next one is Execution by Larry Bossidy, and I counted how many bookmarks I have in here. They're just little post-it notes, but how many books? I have 93 post-it notes in my copy.
Yeah. The way you describe it is if Drucker tells you what to do, Bossidy tells you how to do it. Drucker is not good for telling you how to do things. And we have a very different approach at Manager Tools and Career Tools in that we get in the weeds. And there are some people who don't like that. They prefer to be given the big picture. It's been my experience that the vast majority of people, I'm not saying everybody, and folks, you may be different, but the vast majority of people really appreciate being told, okay, this is one way to do that great idea that you have heard about but don't know what to do in your job, to get people off of, we believe going from 0 to 1, if you're counting, going from 0 to 1 is the big change. Going from 1 to 2 is a doubling, but it's not nearly as big as going from 0 to 1. And getting you started on the process of determining for yourself how you're going to behave is huge. And we're okay with you changing our guidance for you based on your situation. But for the vast majority of people who don't know how to do, because they've not been taught how to do management or careers, or for that matter, self-development, to tell you the truth, we believe getting you started is a noble endeavor. And Execution astounded me with how good it was. To be a senior executive, CEO several times, and to talk in detail, to quote himself about a conversation he would have with a plant manager talking about her year and what she needed to do in the next year. Mm-hmm. The clarity, the simplicity, the lack of vagueness. I know that individual contributors and managers all over the world constantly are thinking, at the executive level, things are different. And yeah, they are in some ways, but they're also very similar in that plain speaking and plain language and clarity of communication are prized. And yes, politically, sometimes we're vague or we make comments like, I don't disagree, which isn't actually agreeing. and one curries favor with one's friends, and one undermines one's enemies, and all those things that are dramatic and people pay attention to. But the fact is, running large organizations is exceptionally complex, and Bossidy takes many examples, many situations, and gives details of how he would handle it. The discussion about people and systems and the amount of time that Larry Bossidy spends on people is priceless. And Bossidy, of course, comes from GE. He was a friend and colleague of Jack Welch. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, when Welch got the top job, Bossidy left, in part for that reason, which is not unusual among high-level executives, folks. And Bossidy then, I know, went to Allied Signal and Honeywell, and he says, look, strategy's great, but you must actually do. A perfect strategy poorly implemented is not nearly good as a messy strategy vigorously and accurately implemented.
I say this page is one of the pages that I have comments on, and he says, let's say you've got a person making all the numbers, making all of his commitments, but his behavior is terrible.
Yeah, and by the way, let me just be clear about something. In some circles, folks, the word behavior implies not organizational effectiveness, which is the way we use it. We use it more broadly than people do. In executive circles, particularly more senior folks who are, I was going to say over 50, but that includes me, use behavior to imply interpersonal behavior, how one treats others, how one communicates with respect and dignity, and so on. So Wendy started again, but I want people to keep in mind that when he says behavior here, he's talking about a subset of what we would talk about as behavior.
Yes. So let's say you've got a person making all the numbers, making all of his commitments, but his behavior is terrible.
And I'm going to interrupt you again. I'm sorry, you hate me for doing this, but I'm just going to say it. Listen to that, folks. Let's say you've got somebody who's making his numbers and making all of his commitments, but his behavior is terrible. You know, at Manager Tools and Career Tools, we would say the first part of that is his behavior is wonderful. Honestly, it is. I mean, he is behaving appropriately from the standpoint of results. Results in organizations are external to the organization, actually, as Drucker would tell us, and are based on human behaviors. They always are. But in this sense, and I'll ask Wendy to start it again, he's referring to behavior in that subset of what we would consider it. So go ahead.
So let's say you've got a person making all the numbers, making all of his commitments, but his behavior is terrible. Charlie's working people 7 days a week. He hollers and he won't hire a woman. You call him in and say, I love you, Charlie, but the things you're doing are going to preclude you from making numbers down the road. People aren't going to put up with this nonsense anymore. You've got a couple of choices. I'm going to be your coach. I'm going to talk to you myself. And I want this behavior changed, or you're not going to go any farther, or you're going to have to leave. And when I read that, I was like, That's almost to the feedback model, almost perfectly, the kind of conversation we would recommend.
You did X, and this is the outcome that you can expect based on doing X. Your behavior is unacceptable, and you need to change it.
Yeah, and he even begins with, I love you, which is, how we start often.
Yeah. And it's different verbiage, and some people would say, Larry Bossidy doesn't use the Manager Tools feedback model. Yeah, Larry Bossidy doesn't have to. Larry Bossidy's smarter than us.
Charlie got the message.
Yeah, Charlie got the message. And that's why we say we recommend specific things to get people started, but they might, in fact, change it. Now, we know for the vast majority of people who aren't as smart and aren't as focused and aren't as accomplished as Larry Bossidy, and by the way, when you're CEO, you can get by with a great deal wider range of behaviors. More is forgiven. If you're not him, then you need something to stick with. And the model is not designed to say for the rest of your career, you must say these words exactly. But if you depart from the model, you still better fundamentally go with delivering it with compassion if it's negative feedback, and then saying, you did this, and here's the outcome of that, and would you please change? Which is exactly what Bossidy did. And folks, we have said before that there's one place we disagree with Drucker. Drucker says repeatedly, the reason to get rid of somebody is because they fail to perform. Now, he has some caveats in there that if you put person in a job that he would call a widowmaker that it cannot be done, it's not fair or reasonable to fire that person because they didn't do well in the job, because it's not him or her, it is the job. And that's a function of organizational design. But Drucker basically says the only reason to get rid of somebody somebody is for performance. He doesn't actually ever say, in my experience, I read everything he's written several times, that you can get rid of somebody because they don't work well with people. In fact, he implies that you could keep that person and give them a job where they don't work with other people. It's been my experience those jobs are few and far between. I wouldn't argue with somebody who chose to do that if in fact they could keep someone and that person would be highly effective. We actually disagree slightly. For the vast majority, and remember, our guidance, Manager Tools and Career Tools, is intended for 90% of the people, 90% of the time. And that's part of the reason why we're the only ones doing what we're doing, is because the vast majority of people think they should come up with an answer that works for everybody all the time, which is ludicrous. And we're simply simplifying things for folks. But we say there are two reasons to get rid of somebody. They fail to perform. In other words, they fail to achieve the results that you've reasonably asked of them. And there's ample evidence that the results are achievable. And the second thing is because they tear down the team. And there's all kinds of subtleties around tearing down the team. But if somebody behaves as Charlie does in Bossidy's example, it's unacceptable. It is unacceptable. There is no professional behavior which can be excused, which is not humane. There is no professional behavior which can be excused, which is not respectful. Now, some of you might argue that firing somebody is not respectful. We disagree. We would say that firing somebody, provided you have worked with them to try to help them, is absolutely respectful of the organization. And if you've listened to our podcast about how to fire someone and about layoffs and so on, you know that we support the idea of humane layoffs, that the manager takes responsibility, and layoffs are virtually always a function of management getting it wrong, and then unfortunately other people paying the price, which is why management's responsibilities and executive responsibilities are so important and must not be entrusted to someone who is not ethical, professional, moral, reasonable, smart, caring. So anyway, sorry, tangent.
No, a good tangent, I think.
Yeah. But no. We've talked about a CEO. I think there's some people who might be listening, Wendy, who would say, oh, this is not for me. And in fact, the whole point of the book is the beauty of it for Wendy and I is it is so for everyone, because if a CEO can talk about big things like what a plant that makes $100 million worth of stuff every year is doing, and he or she can talk in plain language about performance and say, you did well here, here, and here, and I need more here, to use the title of a book I like, Pleased But Not Satisfied, then if they can do it, and if you've been going through your life thinking that there's a better way to do it, or a more executive way, or a more formal way, or has to be vetted or something, you're wrong. It can be done in plain language with care and concern and directness as well. In the same way that the market gives us direct feedback when it likes and doesn't like our products.
Yeah, and the other thing I think about these books is, even as an individual contributor, you can still, these books are still valuable to you because they help you understand what's going on around you, above you, and maybe to the side of you, or maybe in different divisions. You can't play your part in the team unless you know what the rest of the team is doing. And these books help explain what the rest of the team is doing in like you said, in plain and simple language. It's dense reading, but it's not difficult reading.
Yes. Okay, good. Boy, we've spent plenty of time on those two, and well worth it, I might add.
Okay, so the next one is People Smart by Tony Alessandra. And this one is a book about DISC. If you've read all of our stuff about DISC, and you've heard all of the Effective Relationships cast, and you've been to the ECC, and you want one place where it's all kind of brought together.
There's a lot of information in one place in a flexible way. People Smart. Yeah.
This is it. And there's some quick one-page summaries of different things, like this is daily examples of the 4 styles. So things that'll irritate us, and things that who are the celebrities.
Yeah. Who are the people that we know that have that style? What's
their song? Which is
which is amusing, I must say, and you'll laugh when you read it. And that when you have emotional responses to new learning, that's a sign that it's going to be anchored clearly in your brain. Yeah, I found this book fascinating. I would caveat slightly that it's about DISC. It's actually about behavior, right? And it happens to use DISC as the fundamental instrument to create a vocabulary about behavior, which is what we say at our conferences. Today is not about DISC. It's about you changing your behavior. All increases in effectiveness are fundamentally about changing one's behavior. We're not against new ideas. I love new ideas, and a new idea that doesn't change one's behavior will not get you different results. But the book is a fairly condensed way. It does use DISC language at times, and it simplifies things a little bit, and yet it is marvelous. Now, there might be other books out there that use DISC, or frankly use other behavioral instruments, and they might be as effective as well. The fundamental point here is, of all the books we've read, this is the book that most clearly states people are different. And if you want to be more effective, you're going to have to learn how to communicate with different people differently. I say it at the start of every one of our effective communications conferences. This is the single most important thing I've learned in my professional life. Being willing to put effectiveness, and by that I mean the clarity of your message getting across, effectiveness in communication is putting effectiveness above personal preference. We all learned how to communicate when we were young, but we were never taught, which is interesting. And it's fascinating that the average human child essentially inhales through example after example after example the fundamental grammatical underpinnings of the language that they learn without being taught it long before they go to class and learn about participles and prepositions and subjects and nouns and verbs and so on. But you learned it when you were 5. The idea that what you learned when you were 5 can accurately and simply, without any modification, be other than acronyms, be used in the professional world is ludicrous. It's like saying, well, as long as I can ride a bike, I should be good in a sports car. No, really not. And learning how to communicate and being willing to make changes to be effective is a powerful tool. And I can't tell you the number of people that I feel like could achieve 30% more simply by saying, okay, you need to learn that it's not all about you, and you shouldn't be putting your personal preference for being you in front of the respect it shows to change your behavior for somebody else. And if you're wondering why some of your relationships aren't going well, this is probably at the heart of it. So, communication is the most frequent thing you do at work, the most frequent thing you do, and you don't even think about it. If you could improve by even 5% the thing you most frequently do, and you could do that by reading one book or coming to a conference or listening to some podcast, why would you not?
This is the one that, not this book, but discovering that if I acted differently, I got different results.
Yes.
Was the thing that turned my life around. That you know, it just made such a difference.
Yeah.
All these people started thinking I was a nice person.
Yeah.
And I still wasn't a nice person. I just behaved differently.
More harmony, less friction, which makes for more efficiency in the workplace. And the moment you realize it is a powerful thing. And there are some people who refuse to adapt to this kind of thinking because they say, oh, I need to be authentic.
You cannot be not authentic.
Yes.
You can only be you.
So the question is, do you want to be the you that's selfish and you're comfortable with you, or do you want to be the best you? And if you're working with other people, the best you means you have to consider how other people communicate, what they think, how they feel. And you may not be responsible for how they feel. You're not. But in communication, you're responsible for the message getting across, even though the listener is the one that controls it. And of course, we've talked about this. I think it's chapter 29 in management. It may be chapter 32. It talks about communication. And one of Horstman's laws, that is, I assumed all my life, professional life, that Drucker had said it, but he never actually did in the first few paragraphs of chapter 2. But it's why I say communication is what the listener does. But the person who's actually talking or typing, they're the one who's responsible, even though the other person actually does it. It's a bit like being a manager. You're responsible, but you're not actually doing the work.
And the book goes in one place we won't go. So there's an entire chapter on romance, which we're never going to discuss. So if you want disc and romance, or for behavior and romance, you have to read the book.
Yep.
So if you've read the first 3, you'll need a method for getting things done. So Getting Things Done by David Allen.
Yeah. I love GTD, and Mr. Allen's way of monetizing his idea has been brilliant, far better than manager tools. And it's not the only one, but boy, is it good. And if you've ever felt like you've got an inbox here and an inbox there and a bunch of papers and everything else on your desk, and you're willing to do some hard work using Allen's, I can't remember the name of it, Wendy. It's escaping me. How you clean up everything and get a single inbox is just one of the most liberating things. That feeling of now I know where everything is. And he also believes in getting things out of your head and getting them on paper. And there are a lot of people. I think it's safe to say they would call life hacks. Mm-hmm. But I think most people, particularly young people, and this was true for me when I was young, mistakenly believe that they're just doing. And having a system for how you think about how you approach work helps you learn about what you're good at and what you're not. Drucker talks about self-awareness all the time. And Bossidy does as well. And of course, People Smart does too. Everybody has different ways of approaching things, and that's okay. But as I've often said to managers all over the world, you need to have a way for talking about work and making people more effective that's systemic, repeatable, and teachable. And getting things done is absolutely all those things. And I know when I'm feeling out of sorts, it's probably because I need to do a cleanup. And I don't do them as often as I should.
You could either read it and become a disciple and do it exactly the way he says all the time, or you can read it and take little pieces of it and other pieces of other people's. And some people go one way, some people dive in and do everything, and some people just take parts, and both are okay.
Yeah.
Because both are making you more effective.
Right.
The one I use from here that I use every day is, if it takes less than 2 minutes, do it now.
Do it now. Yeah, I don't use that one as much, and probably to my own discredit. The one I use is, what's the next thing? I have a habit of seeing a big thing. I'm good at big thinking, and then not going, okay, what's the first step? And then thinking, oh, I need to come up with a 6-month plan. And in fact, I can definitely trace greater effectiveness when I've said, no, forget about that. Don't worry about the 85 steps or the 600 steps. What's the first thing you can do? And then after that, what's the next thing I need to do? We use that in our coaching model. In fact, our coaching model was influenced by getting things done. And interestingly, as I've told people before recently, and it shocked them, somebody said, where'd you get the coaching model? I said, it's the way I coach executives. This is what I use when I coach executives. And it's one step at a time, folks, because a lot of things seem too big to fix. But as I've said before, in probably the syrupiest phrase ever, by the mile it's a trial, by the yard it's hard, and by the inch it's a cinch. And Allen gives you a good way for doing that, and you'll certainly feel better if you use it.
Okay, so then the last one is Management by Drucker again.
Yeah. Do you know, it's funny, I've had a bunch of people say to me, probably 100 people have said to me in the last 30 years, well, I heard Drucker was the man, and I would nod my head knowingly, and then they would say, so I started with management, and I would go, oh, here it comes, and then I discovered, and I never finished, because management is 400 pages easily. And by the way, Management and the Effective Executive Guys are not his first 2 books. The first book he wrote is Concept the Corporation, about his time at GM. But people start with management, and it's an incredibly dense, incredibly long book that's fabulous to me. But of course, this is my job. And I've told people before, nope, you did it backwards. And they said, yeah, I found that out later. Once I read Effective Executive, I immediately wanted to go back and read Management, and I knew how good Drucker was, and I knew I would finish, and they did. But Management talks so broadly about organizations and about knowledge workers. If you've heard that phrase, folks, Drucker invented it. He invented it to suggest the post-industrial, post-labor world where thinking and deciding were more important than moving and turning and twisting and pushing or bending. And nothing to say there's anything wrong with that. It's just in terms of value creation in the modern world, to say nothing of the information revolution. Knowledge workers came along easily 50, 60 years ago, long before the digital age. But it is an incredible breadth of discussion about all aspects of professional life as a manager, as an individual contributor, as an executive. And the first 150 pages where he describes his theory of the business, the idea that results exist outside of the company, and that executives' responsibilities are external to the company and are about the future of the company and how to think about your business and thinking more broadly. Every single time I've ever used those thoughts, I feel like, to coin a phrase, the organizations I've been involved with have taken a great leap forward. So once you've finished Effective Executive, send us a note and tell us you loved it. And then we'll say, okay, time to start reading management, and you should read it in small doses.
Yes. So the last thing on the outline here is that we want to encourage you to read books. And there are, so many sources of information now. There's blogs and newsletters, and there's summaries of all the big business books. So why read the originals, right? And we can just read the summary, the cliff notes of whatever it is you want to read. And we've got a bunch of reasons. For example, it teaches you or reminds you how to concentrate for long periods of time, which is something a lot of people say they can't do anymore. So if you want to be able to do it again, read books.
Yeah.
It helps you with your critical thinking. If you can read a book and think about whether what the author is saying is true in your experience,
right?
Is you relate what they're saying to your world, and that's how you get critical thinking powers, and they're useful all the time. When you see a presentation at work and you think, well, okay, I can see the logic of what you're saying, but it's not true in my world, those critical thinking powers are enhanced by reading. Blog posts don't have the same amount of information. Even the white papers by HBR or other good publications don't have the depth. They don't have the length to be able to develop the argument so well as a book does. So you get this kind of shallow version of it.
I'm glad you said shallow, because it's been my experience that if you read 500 blogs, you'll find a thread of narcissism that I think doesn't exist inside books. Now, that, I believe, is an artifact of 30 years ago, even 10 years ago. You had to get somebody else to agree that your ideas had value before a book could be published. And the barrier to entry is lower. And without the curation that occurs in publishing houses, and by the way, I'm all for the digital revolution. I love it. My book is going to come out, and it's only going to be available on our website for a while. We're going to self-publish. And then when we come out with a hardback or softback, a physical book, it will also be self-published, because Amazon solves our distribution problem. The fact is, there's a lower barrier, and a lower barrier implies you'll have to read more to get good stuff. There are many, many blogs that are fabulous. Wendy just yesterday sent me something from Seth Godin's blog that she and I both read, and we find him to be very insightful. And books are better. I'll tell you something else. I think probably when they ask celebrities, and some of you won't like this comment, but I think when they ask celebrities, what are you reading? It's interesting. I think a lot of celebrities get asked, and many of them say they're not reading anything at all. But when they ask senior executives, CEOs, what they're reading, they talk about big, thick books, and they're always reading. The President of the United States always has 1, 2, 3, 4 books on his, or someday, hopefully, her bedside. They read. The reading is flexible. Reading is in depth. If it's published, if it's not a digital book, it's curated. And if it's a bestseller, particularly in a particular genre, that means it's probably well written as well. I just finished reading. I just published in Things I Think, I don't know, 15 or so, maybe it was 20 books that I've read since November. This cast is coming out in January. Now I get to read a little bit more during the holidays. I just finished one of Stephen King's incredibly long books, Dr. Sleep. It was really, really good. I try not to read only business books because I just get sad when I do that, because they're all so bad. But folks, you can't expect to get, you can expect to get to executive life without reading. It will probably be slower. Your life will be the lesser for it. And you will be one of the few executives who is not reading when you sit around a table. And there's all kinds of discussions now about TV shows and so on, but I would like to suggest that the best thing about a book is it keeps the TV off.
I'll summarize the list just so everyone can get clicking on Amazon or your bookseller of choice. Effective Executive by Drucker, Execution by Larry Bossidy, People Smart by Tony Alessandra, Getting Things Done by David Allen, and Management by Peter Drucker. But read Effective Executive first.
Yes. And a good list is one that always has one surprise. And I'm sure there are people who would see this list and say, yeah, I see all those except People Smart. And yet still, the fundamental principle behind People Smart is the most important thing I ever learned in my professional life. You've got to communicate in a way to help other people understand you better. Okay. Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
That's it, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it. Reading is the purview of professionals, period.